Hello, everybody out there. Welcome to Boston SciFi Fest Classic Cinema Podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Barbera. Tonight we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite, the anti-hero, which is a big trope in science fiction, as we well know. And I am honored to be joined by two amazing guests tonight. We've got Caro, who is a game designer, a producer, and a community activist, and also an adjunct professor at Northeastern. And then we've got Max Gardner, who's a filmmaker, director, and producer who's based in Brooklyn, and his feature film, Go, Don't Go, actually premiered at the Boston Sci-Fi Fest the last time it was live and in person before the COVID pandemic. And hopefully it'll be back again next year, all live. So delighted to have you both here. I know you guys have a lot of opinions on the movies we're going to be reviewing tonight, so I thought we would get right into it with a clip from the feature Logan, starring, of course, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. So we're going to cue that up in a minute. There we go. Just need some sound.
And we're back.
Well, we'll get that queued up. And in the meantime, I think that we can talk about it a little bit before we get the clip. Sure. So I know that this was one that you were particularly interested in, Max. And I'd love to talk about sort of, the genre merging of it and get both of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think Logan's an interesting one because as a superhero movie, it works well as just a pure kind of anti-hero film as well. Similar in the vein of movies we'll talk about later, like Mad Max. It's kind of like we're in a world where things are different, things are altered, but the conflicts between good and evil remain, the stakes are high and they remain the same. And I think, like, interestingly, James Mangold does a really good job in that movie of making the X-Men world not appear as extraordinary as past iterations of the film have, which then the sort of world building of this gritty, almost dystopian world then backs up, I think, Logan as this character who's fallen out of favor with the larger world and conflict of mutants versus people. He sort of is over it. He's jaded. And yet here he is taking care of Xavier, off the map and off the grid. And so there is this interesting, traditional kind of sense where it is the rugged individualist who is left to, deal with the conflicts in America itself. And so as the movie progresses, you get this interesting balance of them trying to re-inject sort of the righteousness that eventually the anti-hero finds, as they go along their journey, but not before he's sort of confronted with the fact that he used to save people. Now he's only looking after this one person because he feels some sense of obligation. And then this girl comes into his life who might as well be his adopted daughter, X-23. And then he's sent on his path to redemption. Mm-hmm. So it has this kind of down through the valley kind of arc. Then we're on the way up. He doesn't really necessarily follow the traditional hero's journey, but by the time he sort of becomes the great guy that we know Wolverine is, Logan himself, kind of shines through as, again, the one that we really care about, not the superhero. So it's the story of a man, crawling from the depths back to the heights.
Absolutely. It's interesting, too, because I think that with this movie having the more quiet sensibility, I mean, it's very stabby, but I feel like the level at which they're fighting is much more human level, right? They're not, it's not the whole world. They're not flying around in the sky. It's not so epic. It feels like a human level of fighting, like actual obstacles that somebody would be facing. There you go.
Today, to see if I still feel, I focus on the pain the only thing that's real.
What is she?
Beneath the stains
She's like you.
of time,
Very much like you.
the feelings disappear.
She needs our help.
You are
Someone will come along.
someone else.
Someone has come along.
I am still right here.
That's
And
probably
you could have
Yeah.
enough.
I really like
seen
that
it.
song. I was like, oh, I really like that song. It's
Yeah.
a good
Who doesn't
trailer.
like Johnny Cash?
Yeah.
I would love to kind of just use this as a jumping off point to frame a little bit of the discussion around, what is an anti-hero? I think that I think different people probably have different ideas about what an anti-hero is. And so some of the different characters we're going to talk about today may kind of fall into that territory of anti-hero, or are they actually really more of a hero, or are they in fact a villain who has then been recast in this new anti-hero light? So I'd love to kind of get everybody's definition of what they think an anti-hero is.
Would you like to start off? Or would you like
Yeah,
to-
let's hear yours first, and then
Sure.
I've
done some thinking about
add
this.
my informed opinion.
So for me, and the really the critical difference between an anti-hero and a hero is that a hero, the means do not justify the ends, and for an anti-hero, the means do justify the ends. So, or the ends justify, you know what I'm saying. An anti-hero is willing to do evil acts in order to get a righteous goal accomplished, whereas a hero is unwilling to do an evil act in order to accomplish a righteous goal.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of thinking about it. I always often don't place anti-heroes outside of the same moral and ethical constructs that the heroes live in. What they get to do is not have to go down that same road that the hero typically takes. And ultimately they are self-defining, whereas the hero is always prescribed in a lot of ways. To bring up sort of again, rugged individualism, the anti-hero tends to live in that lane, and their journey, especially when it comes into parallel or winds through the hero's journey, tends to reflect that the hero is actually, and you'll appreciate this, Caro, is that the hero is actually the NPC and the anti-hero is the player one, where that is a much more variable and variegated journey for a character than if we're to look at Luke Skywalker and Han Solo. All of Star Wars really puts a lot of emphasis on that Luke's path has been sort of not prophesized, but it's being predetermined by the Force in a lot of ways. And by the time we get to Empire and then Return of the Jedi, everyone's just saying Luke, this was all going to happen the whole time. Whereas Han Solo still has the freedom, unlike the hero, to fall in love, to get into hijinks, to sort of follow all these different paths that the hero's sort of righteousness keeps him bound to, the singular path. And so I always think of anti-heroes as kind of the more interactive or the more interesting characters that emerge. Of course, you get movies where the anti-hero is the main character, like a Logan. And I think in there, we're now looking at a guy who's again, his whole character throughout all of X-Men is he's the guy who's always plumbing the depths and always kind of going off the beaten path to try and figure out who he is, figure out why he's so vengeful and angry, who is he after, and ultimately, when he achieves those things, what does it say about him? And I think Logan is kind of that movie. It's what is a man's legacy when ultimately he has nothing left? And the anti-hero tends to have, at least to me, the more interesting legacy when you post them against kind of the hero's very sort of, up-down motion in the cycle that they embody. So to me, the anti-hero is the independence from having to be the hero themselves.
Those are great points, both of you. Anything else to add about that? Go ahead.
I have a theory basically about where this. So you start seeing antiheroes starting to become really popular, starting with, I really feel like it started in comics in the 80s, where you see Alan Moore is writing these anti-hero stories. There's this like very postmodern reaction to society and what's happening in the world, where you start seeing all these anti-hero narratives starting to emerge. And then in the 90s, you start seeing it reflected in a lot of our TV and movie media. And then I think that trend has continued. And then we're only starting to now enter into an age of transmodernist kind of heroes, where we have these new sort of narratives that are emerging, where you see like Avatar is an early example of a transmodernist narrative, like Avatar and Korra. Steven Universe is a transmodernist narrative. Lots of kids media is starting to do this. But I feel like the reaction of basically the white middle class that was the dominant writers in society at the time was this postmodernist reaction. So a lot of these anti-hero narratives are coming out of basically a position of privilege, a position of being able to say, I can be an individualist, I can be a rugged, go against the grain, do things the bad way and get away with it type kind of thing. And I just wanted to acknowledge that that's like
definitely I think it's a big part of the construct of the trope itself too, because now, to your point, we've been in a period probably for the last 20 years in our popular media cycle where we're fed a lot of anti-heroes.
Yes.
Within genres and outside of genres. I think like what's interesting is you see so much dramatic media, so stuff I typically don't ascribe like a genre focus to, like say it's The Affair or even a cop procedural, which is a genre unto itself, but like there are anti-heroes that exist in these things, and they actually end up being the main characters and often bringing you through their journey. And you're always saying to yourself along the way, well, why do they always get away with this stuff? Why does Walter White get away with all this stuff through Breaking Bad? And so when you apply it very much to a realist lens, you're left with those questions very much. And, you know, like you said, Caro, like privilege does live at the center of that, because if you take it back to the origins of sort of the anti-hero, and I would say it sort of is a post-war kind of thing that starts to appear because men who kill come back from fighting in World War II, and what will they do for a trade? And the trade that they can do now is killing. And so the original sort of traditional modernist anti-hero comes from like noir, The Killers, any of the Philip Marlowe adaptations or Sam Spade adaptations, so like The Maltese Falcon and The Long Goodbye or The Big Sleep. And you have these guys, or even I forget what the last name of the character is, but Chinatown, you know, forget it, Jake, it's only Chinatown. Like you have this reaction that comes out of the post-war period where anti-heroes are bad men. Meanwhile, Westerns are saying bad men are the only ones that are true Americans. And then you have noir come around the corner and say bad men get the job done and often get the girl, but they have to live with the ambiguous consequences of their world. By the time we get to like Frank Miller tooling around with Batman and making him really ambiguous as maybe he's a fucked up dude. Can I curse on this?
I'm not sure.
Yes, I have now. But you know, in a nutshell, he's a bad dude who is a rich guy who goes around in his underwear beating people up because for him it's a form of vindication because his parents were murdered. I think going out of that period where anti-heroes then become sort of popular, so then you get your Tony Sopranos and you get your Walter Whites, you know, in the last 20 years or so. Don Draper.
Absolutely.
We're meant to think about these men as being objects that are subject to a power that is greater than them, which is forcing men, often just men, to embrace these ambiguous choices. I think, interestingly, out of the same period of when Batman sort of starts to become a bad guy in so many ways, we get Batman entering the mainstream in a big way. We get Batman the Animated Series, and out of Batman the Animated Series, we ultimately get the invention of Harley Quinn, who to me is one of the most interesting. And, of course, she's super hyped right now because DC has propped her up as a huge opportunity for licensing. But when Harley Quinn was invented in Batman the Animated Series, no one knew that she was going to become almost more iconic, if right now more iconic than Batman in and of himself. So it's interesting that eventually an inversion does happen along the way, and now we're seeing sort of the ultimate form of that, at least in the pop cultural way. I think Harley Quinn will always sort of start to be continuously reappropriated by different viewpoints along the way.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But yeah, feel free to jump on Harley Quinn right there too.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I feel like Michelle.
No, nothing really major. Just that my perception of the villain is always the interesting character, right? So the anti-hero allows us to have a taste of the interesting villain, but redeemable. So because oftentimes, right, we know that the hero is just so bland, and so that's a great way of escaping the very bland superhero.
Absolutely. I am like so obsessed with Margot Robbie's portrayal of Harley Quinn. Like she's incredible. And Birds of Prey is fantastic. And the new Suicide Squad, she's also incredible in it. Like so wonderful.
She's the only one that saves that movie.
Right? And such an interesting like feminist icon. And this very interesting like reactionary postmodernist like violence solves your problems sort of narrative that gets applied to the anti-hero here is being like used for feminism and like violence as an equalizer, which is really interesting. And I think like it says so much about where we are in society right now that this is actually viewed as a heroic sort of action. I also love the canonical relationship between Harley and Ivy, who are like now a couple in DC canon. And I love that especially because Poison Ivy, from the historical lens, is supposed to be a villain. But then if you look at her values and like what she stands for, she's actually an anti-hero. She's an environmentalist. Like that's her whole thing. Right.
I mean, even the Uma Thurman performance in I forget which one. Is that Batman Forever?
It's
Batman
and Robin. It's Batman and Robin.
Even in that, like she is still she's a professor, she's a scientist, she is a radical, she becomes potentially an eco-terrorist in her transformation.
Yes.
Of course, Batman always likes to direct us towards the red herring that all these villains are doing bad because they want either power or money. Right. Meanwhile, Batman is the one with power and money.
Right.
And so he's kind of like, in this case, I guess he would be representative of sort of the chauvinist capitalist system. But I think like to the point of like sort of the origination of Harley Quinn and the characters that start to form around her, and Birds of Prey especially, I think way more than the new Suicide Squad, but Birds of Prey really crystallizes this idea that anti-heroes don't also have to really have like a reason for being bad. Harley Quinn is born of chaos. She's meant to embody chaos, and that chaos itself can be both righteous, lawful, and ambiguous all in one. So it has, to your point, kind of like a trans narrative within it, that it's changing, it's ever changing, and it can be ever readapted by new audiences and new perspectives on what ultimately this character is saying to an audience.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to me that Harley Quinn's like backstory is that she's a psychologist. And you can see that coming out in Birds of Prey. Absolutely. Who gets drawn into a relationship with a narcissist and becomes addicted to that relationship in like a really codependent, messed up way. And then you see her just dealing with that trauma throughout basically every piece of media that she's in after that. She's constantly thinking about and worrying about her relationship to men and what it means for when she has a crush on a guy, like, constantly reassessing whether or not the person that she's attracted to is a narcissist or not, because she can't trust herself to be able to make a good decision about that. And I feel like those writers have some hands-on experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, I think her emergence now as kind of the only, if you were to ask me, it's the only center of DC in terms of the cinematic universe right now that makes any marketable sense. I think, like, giving another go to the whole Suicide Squad idea, which is a squad of anti-heroes, and it's like meant to be sort of like Troma's War or The Dirty Dozen or any of these kind of movies where the anti-heroes all gang up and they become the heroes through, killing everyone,
through murder.
Yeah. I mean, Harley goes through all of Batman never having to ultimately justify anything that she's doing, just her general iterations, because she is chaos, but through not having to justify anything, she's constantly learning about why it's good to be, Harley, and why it's good to just be herself and trust who she is. And I think that's another, like, hallmark of the anti-hero is sort of the self-directedness and sort of them, and it also embodies the trope. Like, eventually the anti-hero is just like, yeah, they can turn around and shoot the gun over their shoulder and it's going to hit the guy every time. But that's kind of like something that feels very germane to the construction of what an anti-hero is in the first place. I think about Mad Max, which we discussed before. Max is sort of the purest rugged individualist. And then ultimately, like, he enters into a world where children, and this is across the 4 films now, but children and women define the righteousness that he stands to embrace. I mean, in Mad Max, it's pure revenge because they murder his wife and his child, and the world comes undone. In Mad Max the Road Warrior, he's drawn back into society, and it's not because he wants to join it, it's because he wants to make sure they have a fighting chance. It's even more in Thunderdome when they take him, when he has to go to Bartertown. And so as an individualist, he's stuck with the choice of dealing with, the ultimate form of capitalism, which is, I forget Tina Turner's character's name, versus the Master Blaster, the midget on the, excuse me, that's not the right term, but the dwarf on the hulking person. But he's always dealing with the consequences of the actions that heroes could not surmount, like the outcomes that heroes weren't able to beat. And he lives in a world where there are no heroes, so the only hero is the anti-hero. And in the end, the anti-hero doesn't have to worry about things like good or evil. He only worries about himself. But in the end, at the same time, children and women are the only reasons in any of these movies why he ends up caring about himself in the first place.
Yeah, I think that thread kind of runs throughout a lot of anti-heroes, where a lot of them have a code. They have, like, limits. There are boundaries that they won't cross, like kids, like even for Harley Quinn, it's kids, right? Like never involve kids in things. With Mal Reynolds in Firefly, like, he has a code that he lives by, and I feel like he's a little bit more of like a classic hero in some ways, but we get that kind of willingness to do bad things in order to get things done, a little bit of anti-hero flavor from him as well.
Definitely. And he's like the anti-manifest destiny guy when it comes to Firefly. It's like he was on the front lines. He saw what happened. He knows that, our governments can't be trusted, but his code lies with his crew. And I think, Firefly to me is always much more of a Western, but within Westerns, anti-heroes are kind of the notable hero. And they embody why Western expansion was possible, especially in the classic sense. But ultimately in the future, I guess you could say that every or almost every spacefaring movie in a sense is a Western, and you're always going to encounter that character, whether it's Han Solo or Mal, or I'm trying to think like The Expanse is another good example where it's just pure anti-heroes. Everyone's in it for themselves, because the stakes, especially in space, is that you can die at any time, and that's like a given. So their codes have to match the world in which they inhabit, and ultimately it is about, I have to protect me and mine, or just myself.
Right. I think so much of the anti-hero narrative comes out of a reaction to people feeling disempowered or disenfranchised in a system that's unfair, and wanting to have justification for why the dominator culture in which they reside is actually a way by which they can take back that power. It's a very like classic middle class narrative that is like ultimately not based in anything but fantasy. Like violence begetting more violence is really the only thing that violence produces if you really look at history. So it's very interesting to me that antiheroes are so popular right now, and I feel like it says a lot about where we are.
Yeah, I think the notion of violence begetting violence, it's a super base concept in and of itself, but I think like anti-heroes, they can't exist in worlds where there are too many shades of gray. They can only really exist in worlds where they know the stakes and they know that they have to sort of mind themselves. Something usually comes across their desk or their journey that changes their perspective on things. But often at the end of these movies, unless they're dead, they've been changed, but then they just go back to the road that they've been on. That's the main thing with the Road Warrior, is he's always left in the dust there, and Max Roktansky fades back into the world that is beyond the affairs of the people he's just interacted with. Usually all of the Mad Max movies are told from like this omniscient narrator that we later meet at the very end, who's recanting this tale of Mad Max. And so I always think it's interesting that, like, especially with a lot of the Marvel movies these days, which are all pretty much borderline science fiction movies in and of themselves, in some way or another, you know, they're trying to commercialize anti-heroes as being kind of what modern day heroes are. And I think these are movies that are being made in a post 9/11 world. So they have to respond to this idea that danger is omniscient and danger is always there, and the stakes are always very high, even in reality. And in their world, you know, we've all become pretty inured to the third act, big CGI moment in a movie. And like, that's what, you know, the original Suicide Squad suffered from, and that's what the new one suffers from. But interestingly, it's like usually in the moments of any of these superhero movies, I think especially Logan, I think especially of maybe kind of Captain America Civil War, which is like a techno thriller sort of spy movie, but it has a big sci-fi edge to it. Because obviously Captain America is a super soldier. He's the Ubermensch. He was made in a lab, and he is the purest byproduct of hero culture. People want heroes made in a lab that will defend them at all levels. And he is Captain America, so that means he's just Captain Capitalism. And the whole notion is that his counterpart, or his anti-hero, Bucky Barnes, is someone that was spewed out of that system abjectly. And, you know, he loses his arm, he gets this new arm. It's kind of like a Dr. Strangelove scenario where it's a killer arm. And it's kind of absurd, but when you boil it into this sort of preformed Marvel narrative, it becomes really easy for people to say after a while, after they've been introduced to Bucky Barnes, who's a canonical character in the comics, but that they're like, he deserves his own redemption arc in the form of a 8-part, you know, Disney Plus series or whatever.
Right.
And it's an interesting series because they don't ever try to resolve the fact that he has these negative influences. I mean, he goes out of his way to apologize to the father of someone he killed at the end of the show, but it's like, it's not like that resolves anything. You know, we're gonna meet Bucky again, and he's gonna be going through it. He may have learned some stuff, but he's always gonna be zigging along the hero's journey pathway, because ultimately he is not Captain America and he is not the hero. Whereas, you know, at least with the Falcon and sort of that character, he can sort of take the most direct path. He can follow it down there. He can embrace these tropes and be that guy. You know, they're trying to play with that obviously now by, you know, introducing, which the comics had already done, a person of color as Captain America, which in this day and age is a big virtue signaling from a major studio. But at the same time, it's great to see that representation finally surfacing, because for a long time, you know, it's just white dudes as angry anti-heroes and heroes. So in the end, we're now seeing anti-heroes start to inform how we can change our heroes to be more interesting as well.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned earlier, both of you, that it was generally white men who were allowed to have that role, because as we all know now, people of color don't have the flexibility to do that, because they're already being scrutinized. And
Exactly.
you know, a white man can, you know, the people will just assume that, oh, he's fine, you know. So it's interesting now to think about people of color in these roles. And I'm noticing, though, that somebody like the Falcon or the Black Panther, those are very much heroes.
Yes.
So I think it's going to be harder to assimilate different people of color and women. And I guess Harley Quinn is a good example of that it actually does work into that anti-hero role, because
A white woman.
A white woman, right? And a white woman, again, not threatening. So so I don't know how they're going to do that, because we well know now. I mean, if I'm looking at a Black anti-hero and I'm thinking, oh, I'm worried about you. Right.
Well, interestingly, if you look at like children's media and the narratives that are coming out of that space, we have more of a instead of a postmodernist sort of like nihilistic view of the world, we have a much more transmodernist view of the world.
Can you go into that a little bit? Explain what that is?
Yeah. So in postmodernism, you basically have this like sort of the worldview is that basically it's nihilism. Things are shit and no one's a good guy and everything is dark and edgy. think Garth Ennis. Think like basically all the comic writers from like the 80s and 90s, and then a lot of the media that we have produced today. It comes out of like Judge Dredd, exactly. Like and then in transmodernism is a relatively new movement, which is often it has it asks questions that are of a spiritual nature. So asking people a little bit more about like, well, what is right? And is it okay to take these harm-causing actions? So you see that actually coming out, and often there are much like broader themes about mental health and emotional health that are involved in these narratives as well. So Steven Universe is a great example. Like Avatar: The Last Airbender and Korra are great examples of these types of media. And Kipo in The Age of the Wonder Beasts is another one. In those, you actually have characters of color who are the main heroes. So I think that when we see media evolving and changing in the next like 10 to 20 years, that where we have heroes who are of color taking the forefront, I think it's going to be in these transmedia narratives and less in the anti-hero narratives.
Agreed.
Yeah, I could see that. I think like as sort of anti-heroes become more and more mainstream as reasons to make media, tell stories, and kind of ultimately proliferate ideas about, you know, various paths that we take, you know, as long as there's going to be something anti to that or opposite of, or that isn't necessarily in a subject position, but is in parallel and it's dialogue, there will be a level of like, we're never escaping the anti-hero. It's just that the anti-hero is now transformed from the anti-hero to something else entirely, which is a much more potentially open-ended character who's exploring different shades of the journey at any level, like whether it is spiritual or whether it is concepts of ethics and morality and just sort of looking at the broader spectrum of experience itself. I think you get more and more of those stories being told. I think in your milieu, especially in gaming, Caro, is that you get to actually sort of work through a game where it's feeding you other perspectives that may impact your gameplay and the path that you take. And ultimately, movies and our linear media tend to be more straightforward in that sense, where we don't have the variability. But now I think storytellers are really starting to embrace that as well, where it's like, maybe we don't even need a storyline to expand upon plot, or plot doesn't necessarily even have to apply here. We can challenge the characters to question the universe that they're in, or question sort of their position relative to the hero's journey, or to the anti-hero's journey for that matter. So I think anti-heroes in proper are very much a 20th century construct. We're in the 21st century now, so I'm pretty sure a new hero or anti-hero or any type of hero is going to drop any day now. Not all allegories can remain the same.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I was thinking about at the end of the last J.J. Abrams iteration of Star Wars, where you see this huge space battle, and the good guys win, but there are just thousands and thousands of deaths. So you're looking at the sky, Rey, and you're looking at Ben Solo, and he's the anti-hero, she's the hero, and yet the means has been exactly the same for both. And so in a sense, I think that it's kind of hard in this era to say, well, what does really separate the heroes and the anti-heroes? Because they're all just blowing stuff up and killing innocent people in the end.
That's a good point, and it's one of the only things that I really like about the newest Star Wars trilogy it's similar to the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, in that at the very core of it, they're really like using these smaller hero-oriented stories with this background of Star Wars and proper. There's wars going on all around them. And interestingly, this trilogy, more than the other two in a lot of ways, sticks with small moments that you really have to band together throughout the whole picture of the three movies, which is a slog to get through on its own. But I think J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson were both very concerned about this moment of like the costs of war and what do heroes yield us, or what do anti-heroes get us? What do villains bring to us? And it is just pure sort of not like nihilism, or like, it's not that no one cares. It's that this trilogy dropped in a bunch of moments to remind you that the stakes of Star Wars really actually lie always with, and for me personally at least, the background characters, the world building, and that you have to be aware that the world outside of your heroes and your anti-heroes is teeming at the edges, and there's always something else going on there. So if they just remind you, like the bombing run in The Last Jedi at the beginning where Rose's sister gets killed, that's a great moment where it's writ enlarged, but Star Wars so often gets caught up in the hero's journey and sort of the classics because it was built off of that. I think the anthology movies they did, like Rogue One and Solo, did a much better job of really trying to flesh out, like, how did Han Solo become the anti-hero we know and love, and what were those motivations? But ultimately, could he have taken other turns along that way? Well, and then we look at Rogue One, which is really putting what are the costs of war right in front of our main character, who in the end gets annihilated. So ultimately, each of these movies has tried to play with what we're looking at with Star Wars and make it not so much about either the hero's journey or the anti-hero's journey, but sort of what's going on around them that cause them to follow these almost preordained tropes of paths along the way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say for me, like that's what Star Wars so much had been about. Like as a kid, was the idea of the Force, and then things that like the light side and dark side all being one thing, that are these infinite realm that go continuously, like will make itself again and again and again. I just loved that as a kid. That was like the best. And still find that very compelling about Star Wars.
Yeah. So I'd love to lead into kind of the fun controversy over Han Solo. I think we have the clip that was infamously changed in the cantina. That was digitally changed.
Shot first.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So I think is this I don't even know if this is this looks like the original. Let's see here.
Yeah, but this time I've got the money. I don't have it with me. Tell Jabba. Even I get bored sometimes. Do you think I had a choice? Over my dead body. Yes, I bet you have.
Yep, so that's the original.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
and then famously they went and changed it.
Yeah, I mean, George Lucas's decision to change it was more about, I think he was always tinkering with Star Wars even after, the film prints were committed and everything, because he is like, he's almost like the anti-hero of the industry. He's a guy that was shunned by the studio system, so he forged his own path and ultimately becomes the villain in the end. Right. We think of George Lucas now as very much the reason that Star Wars ceased being good, because he sold it, but he also changed it infinitely after we all committed certain things to memory, just like that. I think of the great Han Solo moments, that's like the best one, besides his kiss with Leia, where he's like, I know. I think that's one of it was an improvised piece of dialogue, and apparently Han and Greedo, that was his first day of filming as well on the set of Star Wars. And so it's like you have this great sort of moment where the anti-hero is so well encapsulated by just pure attitude, pure charm, slickness. But in the end, it's like Han Solo's journey is to normalization. In that, even in the new movies, they try to retcon it a bit and make him a smuggler again. He's sort of like estranged from Leia in the new movies or whatever. But at the same time, by Return of the Jedi, he's General Solo and he's become one of the good guys. And so in the end, like, I think the kind of outcome of all anti-heroes is either death or conformity. And I think, like, it's interesting that death is the anti-hero to conformity, because conformity, it sort of, I think, ensures some sort of survival. And it's ultimately like a great pure moment of like, this is the origin of the character. You don't have to know anything more about him than he shoots first.
Yeah. I mean, the third option also is just that he remains an outsider, like Mad Max. Right? That would sort of be he doesn't conform. He leaves, and he just stays an outsider.
Definitely.
Right. This has been pretty awesome. Are there any last thoughts that you'd like to talk about, or are there any of the? We had a number of films that we had sort of on our list to talk about. If there's another last film that you'd like to talk about at all, like Escape from New York or Clockwork Orange, or would you like to talk about one of those, Max? I know you had.
I can always talk about anything.
Right. I'm just looking at our time to try to check.
Yeah, we're about done. We're about done. So I guess we're just about to wrap up. I don't know if
you,
we have any
you
last
tell me.
words.
I'll talk about anything. Just
We'll
Yeah, I
talk
think
about.
all
this is
night, you
probably
know,
a
but-
pretty good ending point. Why don't we talk a little bit of just a couple of your, maybe just to end it off, like a couple of your very favorite anti-heroes. We can start with Marrow. It doesn't have to be one. It just be like a few that you recommend to people. Check out these people.
Oh, check
stories.
out Vincenzo. It's a K-drama. You can find it on Netflix. Vincenzo is like a perfect anti-hero, and it is just a delightful, delightful show. I cannot recommend it enough.
Cool. Max?
Nice. I guess one of my favorites is Luc Besson's Leon the Professional. Obviously, that movie has fallen into some controversy over its sort of pedophilic undertones these days, but I think there's something very interesting about that kind of, especially that moment in filmmaking where Luc Besson was making a lot of these anti-hero type movies on the big platform of blockbusters, be it La Femme Nikita, Leon, eventually The Fifth Element. Corbin Dallas is very much an anti-hero. He's outside of the law. He's like Taxi Driver in the future in some ways. But these guys all ultimately have that heart of gold and that sort of righteousness. I guess the only other one that really comes to mind is Tom Hanks in Road to Perdition. I think that's another great sort of 20th century modernist kind of anti-hero Sam Mendes film. But yeah,
about
those are mine.
About as dark as Tom Hanks can get away with.
I know, right? And he's still at the end, you're just like, oh, God, I love a good Tom Hanks movie.
Yeah. That's
he's always Tom Hanks in every movie.
Yeah.
And of course, shout out to new Mad Max. I think I would love to see more of the new Mad Max universe. I hope Furiosa gets made.
Yeah,
I hope there's a sequel to Fury Road, and ultimately that Tom Hardy gets like his own one shot to fully embody the character too.
Yeah. And I get huge props to Charlene's Charlene, we're on first name.
Charlize Furiosa, yeah. My girl Charlize.
Yeah. Charlize Theron's Furiosa, which is also one of my favorites. And then there's this show on Netflix. It's in its second season now. You're probably familiar with it, Marrow. Beast Stars. It's a really weird anime show where it's basically this world where these anthropomorphized animals have to live together, and it's like a really dark Zootopia with the predator and the prey, and a lot of it's symbolic of sexism and male violence against women. So that's kind of an interesting one to check out for some pretty good anti-heroes in that one. I recommend it, although it's like definitely the most disturbing cartoon that I've seen in a while.
My partner watches that.
Netflix
I started
has
watching
lot
it. It was a little
of
dark.
cartoons.
Yeah,
It is. It's dark.
What
It's
I wanted.
really, really dark. Yeah.
There's like more dark cartoons on Netflix than there are movies.
That's true. Oh, anyway, guys, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to talk to you. You guys are so informed and intelligent and insightful. So thanks. Please do come again to join us. And again, thank you. Next month, we'll be back with a new topic. And I can't wait to see everybody. So bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks for hosting, Michelle.
Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.